Welcome to the Tearing It Up podcast. I'm your host, Taryn. We'll be tearing it up, tearing it down, and tearing it apart, dissecting all things related to those who deviate from the standard. From leaders of their industry to leaders of mediocrity, and maybe a gear review or two thrown in. We shoot the shit and let the conversations flow, so if that's not your style, this may not be for you. Otherwise, listen in. Hope to light a fire in you somehow. Hey everybody! Welcome back for another episode of the Tearing It Up podcast. Before we jump right into the conversation today, I just want to give a quick reminder on the front end. Usually this is at the back end, but just how much subscribing and rating to the podcast can help us continue these great episodes and having these awesome guests on like we have today. I'm really excited to talk to our guest today, Anastasia Allison of Kula Cloth. But we work really hard on the back end to get this pod out there and into the world and share these stories. So a simple, quick subscribe or sharing this episode with a friend helps so much. And with that, we're going to jump right into this conversation with Anastasia. I'm really excited because you are a fellow Pacific Northwesterner. At least now we'll find out if you're from there, how long you've been there. So as you listeners know, out there, Amber still lives up in Tacoma, Washington. I'm from Tacoma, Washington, so the Northwest just has our hearts and souls, and many of the listeners too. So I always love when we have a guest who is living there now or from there or whatnot. It's just an awesome point to connect on. And as far as your brand, Kula Cloth, I'm pretty familiar with it because I worked at a sporting goods store here in Truckee, California that sold it. But I haven't actually ever used one. And so I can't wait to kind of find out just how it all happened, how the idea came about, the why behind it, the need for it, and, why we should all try it out there. And so today, where are you recording from right now physically, Anastasia?
So I live in Granite Falls, Washington State. And in fact, I used to live in Tacoma. I've lived in Washington. It's been almost 20 years since I moved out here. That is shocking for me to even say. I moved out here in 2004 to become a park ranger and never left.
I love it. That's awesome. Where were you before that? Were you kind of all over the place or were you mainly in one spot?
Yeah, so I was born in Florida. I moved to Alabama. After that, moved to North Carolina, and then spent the bulk of my childhood living in Pennsylvania. And right before I decided to move across the country to become a park ranger, I lived for a brief time in Maryland, which is where my parents had relocated to. So I grew up and down the East Coast. We moved around a lot because of my dad's job. But when I was 13 years old, my parents took me and my two sisters on this life-changing trip to all of these national parks in the West. We went to Yellowstone, Glacier National Park, the Tetons, the Badlands, all these national parks. And it really just opened my eyes to a world that I had never seen before. And I sort of have to joke because when you live on the East Coast and people say Washington, you automatically think Washington, D.C. You forget that Washington State is a thing. And so I kind of moved to Washington State by accident. I applied for a park ranger academy and I saw that it was in Mount Vernon, Washington. And I thought it was Mount Vernon, which is actually in Virginia outside of Washington, D.C., because I was just so on the East Coast, you just forget about Washington because it's so far away. And so I applied for this park ranger academy and couldn't figure out why I couldn't get in touch with the guy who ran it. Didn't realize that there was a 3-hour time difference. Finally, I kind of sort of realized my very critical flaw. Keep in mind, this was back in 2004. It wasn't like I had a smartphone and was Googling things. And so anyway, once I figured it out, I just remember thinking, I've never been to Washington State before. It's only for 4 months to go to this park ranger academy. I'm just going to go. And And here I am, still here 20 years later.
Wow, I love that. It's kind of like, fate in that, if you believe in those kinds of things, because like I said, it was an accident. You thought it was on the East Coast still and ended up here, took the chance, and 2 decades later, still here.
2 decades later, I'm still here.
Yeah, it worked out.
I will probably never leave. I absolutely love it here. I have been backpacking, climbing, hiking in the Pacific Northwest now for 20 years. And the thing that I love the most about it is that I'm not even close to exploring all of the incredible places that we have to see here in the Pacific Northwest.
Absolutely. There's so many hidden gems. And I mean, just not to mention the fact of how much time we have in this day and age, or with working and just life in general, to really go out and explore deep into some of these places. You need to be able to set aside a lot of time, and it's just so vast. So it's hard to do it all. It's so beautiful. I mean, we're pretty biased to the West here on the podcast. I can't say much because I haven't spent any time on, like, the furthest I've been east that I've spent any amount of time, like significant time, is Michigan. And I mean, it's beautiful up there, but yeah, I haven't been like fully on the like East Coast explored. And, I've plenty here in Tahoe. There's a lot of East Coast transplants. So I've had the similar thing with Washington. When I say Washington, they're like, if they've been here a while in Tahoe, they assume Washington State, but sometimes it still takes a minute. Like Washington, like, oh, East Coast. I'm, no, Washington State. I usually just say like the Seattle area, just to bypass that. But yeah, so everyone, tells me how beautiful it is out there, and I'd love to go explore it sometime, but I can't help but think there's still so much here that I have not touched that. Mm-hmm. I gotta get some of that in first. And I haven't been to a ton of national parks. And so is that what inspired you to be a park ranger, just that trip with the national parks? Or how did that even come about that you decided you're going to apply for this National Park Academy?
Yeah, so I actually started volunteering with the National Park Service when I was 12. I started volunteering at a small park in Pennsylvania called Hopewell Furnace National Historic Site. I did living history at this particular park, so that means that I was dressed in reproduction period clothing, and I was trying to help give visitors a peek inside what life might have been like back at this spot in the 1830s. It was this dream volunteer job. And when I say volunteer job, I'm serious. My sister and I were out there sometimes in the summer, 40-hour weeks of volunteering when we were kids. We were very devoted to this. And then when when we went on this vacation out to all these national parks in the Western United States, I did junior ranger programs at all of them. And I just sort of looked up to these park rangers because they were opening doors for me into helping me better understand and appreciate the park and learn how to take care of it. And when I thought about what I wanted to do for a living, somebody who took care of the outdoors was like the best way that I could describe what I wanted. And what's kind of funny is that doing all those junior ranger programs actually inspired me to create a junior ranger program at Hopewell Furnace National Historic Site. I did that as my senior project when I was in high school. And then I went to college, and everybody in my college was pre-med. It just seemed like that. And I don't know exactly where I sort of got lost along the way, but I just remember thinking, well, I guess I'm supposed to be pre-med too. And so I kind of gave up this park ranger idea, even though I loved being outside, and decided I'm going to pursue medicine. That's for some reason what I want to do. And I followed a pre-med track my entire way through college. I even worked at a trauma unit. And when I graduated from college, I was in the process of taking my MCATs, not doing very well on them, if I'm being honest. And I was volunteering out at the National Park Hopewell one day, and the superintendent, I think, knew that I was sort of having this early existential life crisis and just sort of asked, Anastasia, what do you want to do for a living? And I kind of looked around at this beautiful park and I just said, I want to do this. I want to volunteer for a living at the national park. And I think he didn't quite understand that it had not yet reoccurred to me, hey, you should go back and reconsider the idea of being a park ranger. Now, at the time, you have to keep in mind, not dating myself too much here, but this was back in 2004, which was only a few years after 9/11. Mm-hmm. And the budget for interpretive rangers with the National Park Service at that time was almost nothing. The only way to get into becoming a park ranger was to go to some sort of a park ranger law enforcement academy. And so that's when I did all this research, found this park ranger academy that was in Mount Vernon, Washington, and decided I'm going to do that. It'll be so great. I can live at home. And then a few months later, found myself moving across the country to become a park ranger. And I did. I became a park ranger. I had the opportunity to work as a ranger for about 7.5 years. I worked on the Hood Canal in Washington State. And it was sort of the realization of a childhood dream for me. And then in about 2011, 2012 timeframe, I got laid off from my job. There was a budget crisis during that time in our state, and they didn't have the funding to support all of the different park ranger positions. And so they sort of went through and eliminated a whole bunch of us. And wow. I was one of those that lost my job. And it was sort of devastating, and I didn't really know what to do. I felt very stuck in being in law enforcement because that's where I was. And so even though I was teaching backpacking at that time, I had started teaching backpacking classes for a nonprofit called Washington Outdoor Women. And I would teach these beginner backpacking classes. And even though that is totally where my passion was, like I was a backpacker, a hiker, a climber, that's what I wanted to do. I did not possibly understand how I could create or do something in that area when my sort of experience was being a park ranger and being a law enforcement ranger. So without really being open to the possibility, I kind of panicked and was like, I have to go back into some sort of law enforcement field. So I ended up taking, very oddly enough, a job as a railroad police officer for about 5.5 years. Which was very unique and different. I did that for 5.5 years, and it was fun in a very different way, but very quickly I started to realize that it was not entirely aligned with what I wanted to do with my life, for the rest of it. And but I didn't know how to get anywhere else. And so I sort of found myself at a crossroads, like, do I just jump ship and continue on with this, like, oh, the grass is always greener on the other side? Or do I really try to figure out how to create something else? And that's sort of that was like the simmering under the surface that was going on prior to Kula coming into the picture.
Wow. That whole story is just amazing of how you came into it in the first place, going through, spending so much time. I mean, being a pre-med student, obviously there's more of us who haven't done it than have, but it's one of those things that you always hear about. I feel like being a doctor, lawyer, those careers are what we hear about from a young age, and just how much time and schooling it takes. So to have put yourself through that, kind of stuff down this dream you had, feeling like you needed to do something else just because of like belonging, and then, like I said, working so hard and putting all this time and effort into things, and I'm sure realizing like I can change I don't have to do this, I can follow this other dream and path. Did you have like any kind of almost guilt feeling with switching from that to, like, how long did it take you to really be able to give up that medical track and say, I am going to go all in over here?
Yeah, there was definitely a feeling of being a disappointment because, you've gone through college. My parents helped out with paying for some of my college education. I actually have an aunt who's a doctor who helped pay for a little bit of my college education because she was so proud of her niece
Oh.
who was going to become a doctor. And so there definitely was that element of feeling like I was letting people down in some way because they had this expectation for me. But, I had not yet fully realized this at that time, but I definitely was one of those people, probably like a lot of us, who spend the greater part of our life seeking validation and acceptance from outside sources.
Mhm.
It was always doing what I should do, doing what was going to make other people finally proud of me, but really sort of almost dulling this calling within my own heart to pursue something because of what people had told me was possible. So,
Mhm.
people don't get to do what they love for a living, or businesses always fail, or, that's just some sort of silly pipe dream, or
Mhm.
that's reckless. And I was told those things and believed them very much so, and was always sort of constantly chasing this outside validation. And no matter how hard I tried, I never really got it. And so as I began, when I finally sort of came back to the idea of being a park ranger, I was actually very excited about it because it felt like for the first time, I was doing something that I was really excited about and wanted to do. um, you know, Years later, when I ended up leaving my railroad police job, I kind of bumped up against those same feelings
Mhm.
too, except almost to an even greater extent because I was literally walking away from the supposed security and safety of this very well paying job to jump into an idea for something that had literally no proof that anybody would even buy it.
Right.
and and but I, at that point, I think the experience of letting go of medicine to follow my heart as a park ranger ultimately ended up giving me the courage
Mhm.
later on in life to say, hey, it worked out before when you trusted your heart. Maybe you should try that again. And lo and behold, I did. And here I am now, 6 years later, and still doing Kula Cloth. So things have a funny way of working out when you trust yourself.
They do. I like that, how you mentioned leaving in that first step there from like medicine to the park ranger, that it did make things a little bit easier for the next transition in your life. And I feel like it's a really good kind of metaphor. Once you take the first jump, yeah, it's still gonna be scary time and time again. How many times have I jumped off a rock or anything into a lake, And, like the jumping off the edge still gives you that feeling in the gut at first. It still might take a second, but you get over it a little bit easier. So that's why it's like so important to do hard things and put yourself in the face of adversity, because if you never do, then when things do happen that you didn't plan for or didn't expect, it's so much harder to deal with and overcome. So we have to remember that in those hard things too, that okay, it's gonna get easier. It's not always easy to see at the moment, for sure. And like I said, you might not feel that second time that it is any easier because the decision part might not be, but it's probably the recovery that's maybe a little bit easier. It takes a little
Mhm.
less time to like accept it or jump into it. And like I said, I think that's just a really great reminder for people that it does get a touch easier doing these harder things the more often you do them. And if we're just staying content in life, then I don't know, we're just going to be content then in our life. We're not going to have these like super exciting or happy moments. We're just like floating through. And a lot of us go through time periods where I think we have to do that. There's things outside of our control that's where we're at right now. It's just kind of skating through, and that's totally fine. You got to do what you got to do. But when it comes to the time that you can make those choices and decisions, like, do it. Like, try to follow that heart. Like, yeah, you got it, because it is scary. And I just listened to a podcast before we got on here that was talking about like freelancing and service industry jobs, and just how those don't have the security of 401ks, health benefits, all this and that. And that's why we feel this pressure to do things like medicine or stay in like law enforcement in these stable jobs, because the generation of our parents, that was really ingrained into them. So they tried to ingrain that into us of like, if you don't have these things, like, you're nothing. But how I've always felt is, well, I'm not guaranteed. I don't want to live to go through all this just for my 401k so I can retire at 65 to use that 401k. Like, I'm missing out on things I can do now. And it's an interesting balance. I think the generations, people are getting better at doing those things, taking those risks and whatnot, because it does feel like, well, you know what? If I'm going to take a risk and go start my own business and see what happens, I can go get a job at a restaurant. I can go do something to pay the bills, but I'd rather take the risk and try it than to have always wondered and, like I said, just be only content with life and not excited.
I totally agree. And, something that I realized along the way, and this is sort of having, I'd been working for the railroad for maybe about 4 to 5 years. And I realized that I was feeling that sort of like my life was on autopilot. I was just sort of checking the boxes, doing the quote unquote responsible thing, not pursuing the stuff that really, really excited me. I had always been very entrepreneurial as a kid, but had a lot of very, very limiting beliefs around money, around starting a business, around like my own worthiness. And in 2017, early 2017, I was driving home from a snowshoeing trip with my mom and my husband, and the car that I was driving, or our truck rather, we spun out on the highway, hit a patch of black ice, spun out on the highway, flew into the path of oncoming traffic, which actually was a semi truck. And now obviously there is a very happy ending to that story, because here I am on your podcast today. But what that incident for me became this 180-degree turn in my life, because I had really been sort of asking for like, okay, what is next? I don't even know how to get to where I want to go. And in that moment of like flinging across the highway into the path of this truck, it was sort of this moment of disbelief, and everything slowed down, kind of like they say happens in the movie. Everything got really slow. That did happen. It got very slow, but I wasn't afraid of anything. It was weird that I could be looking at my own mortality, and I was so unbelievably present in that moment that there was no space for fear to exist. And after that incident, which really shook me for quite some time, I went back to my quote unquote normal life and looked at all of the fears that were preventing me from actually pursuing anything that I was truly interested in. And I began to question, okay, if I can look at my own mortality and feel no fear, then is it possible that all the fears that I have about pursuing the stuff that really excites me in life, is it possible that I am the one manufacturing that fear? And I unfortunately had to swallow, or maybe fortunately, had to swallow the bitter pill that I was the one stopping me from, I could blame, I'm sure I could blame so many people for, what they taught me, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, it was me who wasn't taking any steps forward. Nobody else could take those steps for me. And I just started taking tiny little steps. I started an online hiking group. This is while I was still working for the railroad. I started an online hiking group, started teaching backpacking. And it was wild as I began to change my life. I was a very negative person at this time. It's funny because most people now just know me as this almost obnoxiously positive person, like so positive that it actually probably annoys people. And it's genuine. It is not putting on a facade of any kind. It is genuine, very heartfelt gratitude and appreciation for life. And prior to this near-death incident happening, I did not have that. If there was a group of people complaining, I would have been like right in the center of it, some sort of like little wine fest. And I'm not talking about the wine you drink. I'm talking about the wine, the wine that adults should not really be doing. I was like the ringleader for that. And I just looked at my life and all the stuff that was wrong. And I just complain. And it was funny. I began to have this awareness that the more and more I complained about stuff and focused on all the stuff that was quote unquote wrong, it just kept getting worse and worse. And after this incident, I began completely changing my life. I started meditation practice. I started practicing gratitude every day. I experienced just like deep and profound appreciation for being alive. And it was miraculous to like watch things just start to change. I mean, I started this hiking group, opportunities started coming out of seemingly thin air. I ended up getting a job as the backcountry trail scout for Backpacker magazine. When I say job, it was volunteer, but still, I mean, like, a dream come true for me to suddenly be finding out that my way into potentially creating a job for myself in the outdoor industry, it was starting to seem like this actually could be possible. Like, I think I can do this. And I just started taking little steps. And as I started taking little steps without really needing to know the path, it was like the path started to show itself to me in that process. And that really was kind of the beginning of finding and learning to trust my own trail, learning to trust my own feet, and learning to trust that when I focus on what I want to create, things sort of find a way into your life.
That I love all of that. I mean, it gave me goosebumps listening to you talk about just kind of the like standing in your own way, because as I kind of mentioned, earlier, when we go through these times in life where we're just like content, we're just putting our head down, doing the thing we got to do. There are absolutely times, right, that there are the outside things that we can't change and hold the cards or whatnot. But a lot of times, and this made me think, like, after this, I feel like I need to go write some stuff down myself of like really looking at things. Like, what are these fears, these things stopping from you? Like I said, are you manifesting or manufacturing them yourself? Are you just standing in your own way? Are these, excuses, kind of reasons, rather, that you're procrastinating or whatnot, that you do have more control over than you realize? Maybe it's not complete control, but you can take maybe a little step to change that. And I think, again, it's just another great reminder for us to really sit and think in our own thoughts of, especially if we have something we really want to change in life. Like, okay, seriously, write it down. What are the things stopping you? And take a hard look at them, because you can, like I said, take little steps to change some of them. Maybe you might not be able to take that whole fear or reason away, but maybe it's that one thing a day that you can chip away at to get yourself to that point, instead of just looking at the big long list of like, this is why I can't do it right now. And again, I know there's times that we just can't look at that, but if you're questioning anything at all right now, any big move or change, I think find some time, write down the things that are stopping you, so you can maybe take a little tiny thing off that list so it's not as overwhelming. Just like what they say with to-do lists, right? If you got a to-do list that's a whole page, 20 items long, you're less likely to get all that done or feel accomplished at all. At the end of the day, you're more like, oh, well, shoot, I got nothing done, even though you did mark some things off. But if you can pick the 3 priorities and get those done, then you feel so much better about your day. So just kind of minimizing the list to do to get yourself that one little bit step forward.
I totally agree. And I would never just tell somebody, oh, just quit your job right now. That's the right decision for you. It's more about, I think what I would want people to understand is that removing or acknowledging these fears is more about allowing yourself to be open to the possibilities. And what I mean by that is you might have a thought, for instance, it's not possible for me to have a career in the outdoor industry. Okay, that's a real thought, but is it true? It's not necessarily true. Like, it is only true if you continue to say, it is not possible for me. And so the thing that I did when I kind of began to look at my own fears, I didn't just go out immediately and quit my job and like make all these completely like rash, unplanned decisions. That is definitely not what I would recommend to folks, because that would honestly just be way too jarring. Like, don't do that. I definitely, like, it took me time to make these decisions. But what instead I did was, instead of telling myself, this isn't possible, I can't do it, I'll never make a living doing this, I changed those extremely limiting beliefs and fear-based mindset to, I'm open to the fact that, like, I could do this. Like, there is a way in this universe that I could create some sort of a career in the outdoor industry, and I'm open to seeing what that looks like. And it is a tiny little shift in your mindset. But what happens is, like, in that moment where you suddenly say, I don't know how to do this, but there's a way, you have instantly changed your perspective, your energy, and it's almost like, your little antennas are now starting to look for, they're going to start to notice things that you wouldn't have noticed before, because before you had just built up a wall and said, this is impossible. But the second you say, okay, this could be possible, I don't need to know all the answers, but I'm just open to seeing what it looks like, that's when you can start to let ideas in. And it is not a bunch of big giant leaps to go start a company. It's a bunch of tiny little steps. It's like, I started an online Facebook group teaching backpacking and hiking. I did all these tiny, tiny little things that ultimately led me back to an idea that I had in 2016 on a backpacking trip. I was out in the Wind River Range. I, at the time, was using just this ugly old scrap of fabric as a pea cloth. And I had an idea to take a photograph of it as a joke to give to a friend. Because I thought that was like hilarious to take a picture of my pea cloth at sunset. And I was taking this photograph. Now, remember, this is a year before I actually even left my job. I was taking this photo, and it was literally like, in that moment of just being totally present with this ridiculous pea cloth on a trekking pole, that like a lightning bolt of an idea just was poof in my head. And it just said, why isn't that a real piece of gear? And I remember thinking to myself, why isn't it? I had been teaching backpacking for many years at this point. I was really frustrated with, how much toilet paper I saw in the backcountry. And when this idea came to me, I remember thinking, wow, I wonder if I could design something that was actually meant to be a pea cloth, and then maybe people would actually want to use this, because that was the biggest objection that folks had to a pea cloth. initially was that just using something that felt like you pulled it out of a rag bin at a Jiffy Lube seemed gross. It's like, why would I want to wipe again and again with some old rag? That's disgusting. But then I thought, wait a second, what if it was antimicrobial and I could design all these features? And so I went home from that backpacking trip and I did what probably most people would have done. I did a little bit of research. I got excited about it. And then all of those limiting beliefs that I mentioned about how I couldn't afford it, how I wasn't good enough, how nobody would ever buy it, how this is a stupid idea, Anastasia, you're dumb, don't do this, this is reckless. That all came in and I said, nope, this is a dumb idea, not going to do it. I need to stop living in some sort of crazy Anastasia pipe dream and just quit complaining, Anastasia, go back to your job. And then a year later, after that near-death experience, and now I'm starting to take all these little steps, this idea comes back to me. Except now I don't have much to be afraid of because I've already sort of gotten to peek into the thing that I was supposed to be afraid of and I wasn't. And I realized like, okay, wait, what am I afraid of? What is literally the worst thing that could happen here? People don't buy my Pika cloth. Like, okay. Like that's actually in the big scheme of things, not that bad. And so I just got started trying to figure out how to make it. And I had no sewing experience whatsoever, no textile experience. But one of the things I've learned being an entrepreneur is that I do have one special skill that most of us have, and that's the ability to make a phone call or use Google. And I knew a friend who knew how to sew, and so I called her and I said, "Hey, what do I need to? This is my idea. Like, what do I need to do this?" And she said, "You need a serger. I have an extra one. I'll loan it to you." So I drove down to her house, picked up this serger and brought it home and I went and bought a bunch of fabric, just like random samples. And I just started practicing. I actually brought my, I know that audio listeners won't be able to see this, but I'm going to show it to you, Taryn. This is the very first Kula Cloth that I attempted to make, and I'll describe it. It looks like a conglomeration of shapes. It's
Can you put it more
puckered
in the camera? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so this is the very, very first Kula Cloth. I mean, I didn't even close the seam. There's a hole in it. I obviously had no sewing experience. And so for a comparison's sake, I'll show you what a Kula Cloth looks like now. And you can compare the two. So one of them is beautiful. It features art. It looks like an actual piece of gear. The other looks like something that you found in a trash can. But this is where I started. And honestly, this little scrap of fabric, Kula Cloth, is probably my favorite because it's really the first time that I hadn't told myself, you can't do this. Clearly, I did not have the skill to be sewing anything, but I kept going, and I would sit in my guest bedroom and I would sew these squares over and over and over again. And eventually they started to look like squares. Eventually I could sew a straight line. Through the hiking group that I had started, I found a bunch of people who were interested in testing prototypes of my product. I started reaching out to textile mills, trying to figure out how to get this thing made. I literally Googled the phrase, how do I find a place that makes stuff for me? Because I did not know the term cut and sew facility. That was not like in my vernacular of like, I don't have a background in sportswear design, product design, anything like that. I did not have the luxury of having a team of people who were just like, oh, let's just, call our factory and they'll be able to make it. It was starting from complete scratch. And I know for a fact that if I can figure this out, other people can absolutely figure it out. It was a wild experience to put all the pieces together and learn about things that I had never learned about in my entire life. But very slowly, the product itself started to take shape. And now, 6 years later, it's sold around the world. It's sold at REI. And it all started with me just making a really, really ugly square thing on a sewing machine.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I love that you still have the very first like prototype you tried to sew together. It's amazing. And like you said, just having no idea where to start, I think that stops a lot of us. And I had a similar experience when I just trying to get branded fabric glute bands for my personal training business. I was like, I have no idea how people do this. How do you get like something like this branded? I'm not on just Vistaprint getting a logo on a mug or something, and
Right.
found like Alibaba or something. Like, what is all this? Like, how? Wow! And it was just a whole different world. But I was typing in things just like that of like exactly what, like, I don't know the correct words I'm looking for. And that is the glorious thing about Google now is you can literally type what's happening in your brain, and you slowly through the searches you find one thing that gets you a step closer. Like, oh, I'll try this term instead, or I'll try this term instead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's amazing. Like you said, like I didn't know the cut and sew term or whatnot, but like you start reading a little bit, you figure it out, and then it does take a lot of time and sifting through some mud and whatnot. But the fact that you just tried, it sewed that square over and over and over again, and had your Facebook group to have support and have people try this out. Like you said, it wasn't this giant leap. Sometimes people do that. Yeah, they take a huge leap, quit their job, just like, bam, done. But it doesn't have to be that way, because you can take these tiny little steps to figure things out. What was so I know your story, you saw or thought about the pea cloth, like you were using this fabric, and this is a missing piece of gear, and you're tired of seeing the toilet paper out in the backcountry. I'm sure that there's still plenty of people out there who are adverse to the idea of Kula Cloth because of the repeat use of it. Can you explain to the people listening, like, how they would use this backpacking and why it's like so much? Obviously, we know why it's more sustainable, but like something that can convince them to get over that fear?
Yeah, I sure can. And I'll also share with you that I think there's a bigger piece to hygiene in the backcountry. And I'll share that on my very first backpacking trip ever, it was led by a man who was a park ranger that I knew through work. And there was a whole group of us rangers going to go out on this backpacking trip. I had never been before. I did not feel comfortable asking this older gentleman how to handle peeing and pooping outside. And I did not have enough experience to know really any better. And he obviously did not feel comfortable enough to even mention something to me and perhaps recommend resources like, hey, what are you doing for your hygiene, Anastasia? And I did not bring toilet paper on my very first backpacking trip. And very, very quickly, once we reached our campsite, realized that this was a critical error. And I've told this story many times, but I'm always embarrassed to admit that I literally stole toilet paper from my tent mate because, and when I say literally stole, I mean that I waited until she was out of the tent and went into her backpack and stole it. And to this day, I don't even know if she knows that I did this, but it was really distracting. And I have reflected so much on that incident. And of course, now the universe has such a funny sense of humor because I literally teach people about hygiene for a living now. But that, I didn't go on that backpacking trip, and nobody goes backpacking because they want to sit around and think about pooping and peeing and what they're going to do with their hygiene. And I had such a distracted experience on that trip because the whole time I was worried about oh my gosh, what if I have to poop again? What am I going to do? I don't think she has enough toilet paper that I can just continue stealing it. Am I going to have to use a sock? I have no idea. And it was so distracting. And I genuinely don't want other people to have that experience. So number one, I think the Kula Cloth, because of how it's designed, it's beautiful. It looks nice on your pack. It invites conversations around hygiene so that more people are talking about it, more people are open to it and sharing information. And other folks out there are going to be far less likely to be in a situation where they don't know what to do. So that's really, really important to me. Prior to the Kula Cloth, what most people were using, and some still do use for a pea cloth, is something like a bandana, a piece of microfiber, something like that. Now, I am the first person who will never discourage you from doing what works for you personally. So if somebody wants to use a rag, go for it. If that is the method that works for you, when we're thinking about backcountry hygiene, it's important you're doing what makes you feel best on your trip. And if a Kula Cloth doesn't, that's okay. But when I looked at that process, the process of just using a rag, there were certain things that I didn't like about it and things that I thought might be a barrier for other folks who were considering using a pea cloth, but were maybe a bit squeamish about it. So number one, if you're just using a rag, you have no way of knowing which side you've used, what side is dirty. And so very often the pea side is touching your backpack, it's touching your hands, it's touching anything you're rubbing up against. Not only that, but when you lay your pack down on the ground, now you have this rag that will later on be touching a sensitive part of your body, potentially laying in the dirt. And the idea of that didn't feel good to me. You also, because you don't know where you've used on it, now your hands are getting dirty, possibly putting them on where you've peed, whatever it is. And so those were some of the things that I really wanted to consider when I was designing the Kula. So I'll give you a little, the nickel tour of the Kula Cloth here. So there is a print side on the Kula Cloth. Most of the Kulas are printed with beautiful original art. So some of them are artist series, and a portion of the proceeds from those goes directly to the artist. We also do collaborations with nonprofits. And so a portion of those proceeds go directly to a nonprofit that Kula supports. We do have one Kula Cloth with no design whatsoever, and it's the Stealth Kula Cloth. It's just black. So for people who are uncomfortable with the idea of having a really visible pea cloth, there is an option for you. You don't have to have art on it. But the sort of smooth printed side is made of a special waterproof fabric so that when you actually use the antimicrobial absorbent side, you aren't going to get your hands dirty. So to use the Kula, there's a snap up at the top of it, and you just unsnap it from your backpack. Then you find a place 200 feet or more away from water sources on a durable surface to squat and pee. Then you are just going to use the antimicrobial side of the Kula Cloth, basically just to pat dry. You're not wiping from front to back. You want to keep the Kula entirely in the pee zone. You're basically just absorbing any residual moisture. What happens if you drip dry? So what happens if you drip dry, which is the method that some people use, is that there is literally no way that you can get rid of any or all of the moisture from having to pee. And so what happens is your underwear, unfortunately, becomes kind of a de facto pee cloth. And that really sets you up, especially on a multi-day trip, for chafing, for yeast infections, UTIs. So it's really important to dry off in between peeing. And that's just going to keep you cleaner and more comfortable on your backpacking trip. After you use the Kula, you snap it back to your backpack, and then there's a double snap on the bottom, and that allows you to snap the Kula Cloth in half. So it sort of looks like a little taco holder. And what this does is it is now preventing the used part of your Kula Cloth from touching the backpack, from touching your friends, or if you set your backpack down on the ground, you aren't getting dirt or horse poop, whatever, is not touching that side that you are then going to be putting up against your body. Finally, there is a little strip of reflective thread. It's on both sides of the Kula. So if you wash your Kula cloth, if you're on a backpacking trip, I usually recommend washing it in the evenings before you go to bed, hanging it up to dry. But if in the middle of the night you decide, oh, I have to pee, you wake up and now you can't find it because you can't remember what tree you hung it in. If you have your headlamp, you can find your Kula in a tree. It sort of glows like a little beacon. So those are the things that make the Kula special and hopefully more accessible to folks that would have otherwise been squeamish to try a pea cloth.
Wow, that answers so much just for me. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning too, I worked at a gear store here in Truckee that sold Kula Cloth, but it was one of those things that educated backpackers would come in and they're looking for those products like wag bags and things like that for like hygiene in the backcountry. Most other people weren't really, and we didn't carry a whole lot of them. We weren't selling a lot of people on them unless the conversation kind of came up and someone asked, like, what do we do in the backcountry? I'm a first time backpacker, whatever. But a lot of the more novice backpackers or campers, they hadn't come to that yet. They probably weren't even thinking of hygiene and whatnot. And yeah, I never, to be honest, like looked into all those features of the cloth. So when you mentioned like keeping it away from being on the ground or touching it, it's like, how do you do that with it hanging? Because I knew it had the loop. So that makes so much sense with that taco fold, that now it's not just rubbing against the backpack. And the pat dry answers a lot of questions for me too, because I just assume like, okay, if you have a wipe, you're gonna like full wipe. And pat dry. And I love it so much. I'm sold because I fucking hate drip drying. And I have a lot of friends who like, I love peeing outside. I think that's cool and great. I get it. I love that freeing feeling too. But I hate doing it if I have to drip dry because of what you mentioned with now underwear is wet. And if you're it's one thing if you're on a run or a short hike or something like that, but multi-day, and then you're like, because that means you're packing a bunch of underwear or washing your underwear and just a whole lot of things, when it's so much easier to have this cloth for a pat dry. And when you do wash it in the evenings, is that just a little rinse off with water, I assume? Or are you putting any kind of soap?
Yeah, so usually you could do only water. But what I usually do is I bring a tiny little like half-ounce bottle, Nalgene bottle, and I fill it up with Bronner's peppermint soap usually. Then I take my water bottle and the soap and the Kula, and I walk 200 feet or more away from natural water sources. I'm usually doing this over top of some sort of a durable surface. I don't do it on vegetation because any salt from your urine could attract critters. Oh. So I'm walking away from my campsite. I'm putting a little bit of soap, I'm agitating it, and I'm rinsing it out. And then I usually hang it to dry overnight. And I wash it in the evenings on backpacking trips. If I am just out on a day hike, I will get back home that evening and I will either rinse it out in my sink or I will throw it in my standard washer dryer. My only sort of forewarning, if you're going to throw it in your standard washer dryer, is to make sure to fasten the snap on it so it doesn't get snagged in the agitator, and keep it away from anything that has a ton of Velcro in it because that can damage the thread around the edge.
Okay. Yeah, all of that makes a lot of sense. And even just not peeing at your campsite, because I didn't realize urine would attract critters. So wow, I feel like I've just learned a lot for being a person who is an outdoor enthusiast. You know, I've never been a huge backpacker by any means. I'm like, wow, like I said, tons of little nuggets. Your designs are beautiful on them. I love the artist collaborations and the nonprofit collaborations. I know you've done brand collaborations too, like with NARA. We had Georgia on the podcast from NARA, so that's a cool. Is that recent or was that a bit ago, the NARA collab?
Oh, I actually started working with Nara back before they were Nara.
Oh
I
yeah, with Sheafly.
started working with them and they were She-Fly, and I befriended them as they were in the process of making their very first pair of pants. In fact, I actually have one of the first pair of She-Fly pants that was ever created in the history of the world. And I've been working with them ever since. And I definitely think that the Kula Cloth and Nara are sort of like a perfect pair because you're peeing, you have your pants on still, and now you can pat dry. The Kula also works. There's a bunch of other products out there that are meant to make peeing more accessible for anybody who traditionally squats to pee. There's a product called a Freshette, which is like a pee funnel. There's one called the Pee Style. That's also a pee funnel. The problem with using a lot of those products is that they are plastic. So you can pee out of this funnel, but that does not solve the problem of like excess moisture. And that's sort of where Kula comes in, is that now you can have this product that you can use in tandem with these other ways of making peeing outside easier, and then not pull your underwear back up and feel like a swamp for the next 4 days.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point with the other products like funnels. It's like that solves an issue for some people who prefer that method, but there's still the issue of the dampness. I also see like on your website you have a few other products. Are these just like brand partners, or are some of them your own that you've made, like the neck gaiters? Is that something you created?
It is. Yeah. So I actually am the inventor of the Rapunzel gaiter. It's a patent pending design, and it is the very first neck gaiter that is designed to be compatible with long hair. In my free time, I ride a motorcycle, and I have also very, very long hair. And I realized that in the colder months, I'm wearing a neck gaiter with my helmet to keep me warm. And when you have long hair, you're sort of in this situation where you either have to tuck your hair into your motorcycle jacket, which when you're leaning over on a motorcycle, it gets snagged. It's very uncomfortable. It's kind of pulling your head. Or the only other option is to kind of floop your braid out of your jacket. And I'm sure this is the same for skiers or snowboarders. You floop your braid out of your jacket underneath your neck gaiter. This is the only way to do it to prevent the gaiter from just falling down. Because if you pull the braid over the gaiter, the whole gaiter just falls down, especially when you have a ton of hair like I do. And so I had this idea one day. I remember I was just like, oh, I wonder what would happen if I cut slits into my neck gaiter and I could just thread my braid through it. And I did it. And it was just like this life-changing moment for me as a long-haired person. I was like, oh my gosh, I can have my gaiter tucked in and actually use it. And I was sure somebody out there had done this already. And I did a search and they had not done it. And so I got to work on a design, and about a year later, finally had the patent pending status. And it's been quite a process to get a patent. And now I have this product that is a neck gaiter for folks with long hair. And then I also designed a pair of hiking underwear called Pika pants. And those are a type of underwear that sort of double as shorts. I don't like to carry a lot of extra clothes when I'm backpacking. So I will usually wear pants because I like to protect my legs. But if I get hot, I never wanted to like take off my pants and hike in a pair of what was very obviously underwear bottoms. And so I designed this pair of boxer briefs that double their underwear that you can wear under your hiking pants, but they also double as shorts. So in fact, yesterday I went on a hike and I literally wore my underwear on the hike.
I love it. I love it so much. I hate wearing pants. I've definitely been in that situation, like, oh, well, now I just have underwear, and like, depending on who you're with or whatever, you're just like, just not comfortable. I love the look of these shorts. I'm looking at them on your website right now. And then with the gator, I think I first saw that on LinkedIn, and I wanted to talk about it here because our audience is, so many of our listeners are outdoors girls, whether they're skiing, snowboarding, and it came from you for motorcycling. But yeah, anything. I'm just thinking about all these things were going through my head because I have that same issue. I've got long hair, always do it braids. Snowboarding, it's like, yeah, sticking out, so you get a little gap there. Snowmobiling, that's another one, like, okay, now my braid's way up here with my full face helmet and things. Thinking about the summertime, hiking, like just having your braids out if you want it for sun protection or whatnot. There's so many uses, and we've seen these hats, whether they're baseball style caps or beanies that have the hole in the top for like your bun or your ponytail, look cute. I was shocked too when I saw your gator on LinkedIn of like, wait a second, no one's thought of this? Like, I haven't even thought of it. Like, yeah, how have we done this so long without this?
I can't wear a ponytail because my hair is so long that it is heavy and will actually give me a headache if I try to wear a ponytail. So I can only really wear braids. And the first time I used my prototype gator, which was literally another gator that I had bought and just cut slits in. And I just remember, like, I zipped up my jacket and the gator was still tucked into my jacket without my hair flooping out over the edge and my neck exposed. I mean, the excitement that I felt was disproportionate. I mean, but when you ride a motorcycle in 55 degrees, 50 degrees, sometimes even in the upper 40s, it is frigid. And having wind going down your jacket makes that even more miserable than it already is. And so we sell a fleece, more of a cold weather version of this gator. And then we also just recently released an everyday version of the gator, which is a lightweight material that could be used for sun protection or probably like even shoulder season, hiking, outdoor sports. Yeah, it works pretty slick.
That's amazing. I don't want to keep you too much longer. You've shared so much with us today. I am curious though, is there any significance with the names behind these, like Kula or Pika? Do those mean anything?
Yeah, so Kula, the word Kula means community, actually. And I came up with the name for the product after listening to a podcast where Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx, was interviewed. And she was talking about when she was looking for the name for Spanx, she had heard a story that using a hard K sound made something more memorable. And you think about brands with a K, like Coca-Cola, Kleenex, Q-Tip, right? Like there are some big brands out there that have this like punchy K sound. And so I was sitting at my kitchen table and I Googled the word Kula I Googled the phrase mountains that start with K. And this mountain came up. It's a mountain in Bhutan called Kula Cloth. And I had gone to Bhutan in 2011. In fact, right before I found out I was losing my job as a park ranger. So it felt to me like, I don't want to say a sign, but like kind of like a sign, like, hey, pay attention to this name. And then I Googled the word Kula itself, and the word is used in pretty much almost so many languages on this planet, including English, but like there are various forms of the word Kula. It's not like ascribed to one particular culture of people. It is just sort of this universal sound. And one translation of it was the word community. And that was really the definition of what I wanted to create with this product. Was I wanted people to see somebody else with a Kula Cloth on the trail and just have this like instant connection. And I hear stories like that all the time where people meet other people just because they notice a Kula Cloth on their pack. So that's where the word Kula came from. I also wanted it to feel not jokey. I had noticed that a lot of hygiene products had this like really jokey, I mean, don't get me wrong, I joke a lot about hygiene, but like the name itself, I wanted it to evoke this feeling of adventure and fun and connection, but not necessarily like, ha ha ha, it's funny that you pee.
Yeah, it's a real thing. People can take it serious that it's not just like, hey, here's a pea cloth if you want it because it's funny to have one. But it's like, no, like the backcountry hygiene and sustainability, it's like absolutely real and serious. And it's not, you don't have to feel like it's a joke to have one. It's a real thing.
Right. Like I feel like people are much more likely to put a Kula Cloth on their backpack than they would if I had called it like the pee-pee pad or you know what I mean? Like that's just like gross sounding. That doesn't sound like a real piece of gear. That sounds like a funny haha joke. And then Pika, there's an alpine animal called the Pika, which is a very, very resilient little critter that lives in these sort of unforgiving alpine conditions. And I've just a huge Pika fan in general. And I've always wanted to have this sort of gear company called Pika. And so Pika gear is, when I started designing and making apparel, I didn't want to call it Kula Cloth because Kula Cloth, it's a brand, but it's also very specifically a product. And the gator, you know, I didn't want people to think they were putting a pea cloth on their neck.
Yeah.
You know, it is it's a technical gaiter for like outdoor enthusiasts who have long hair. It has nothing to do with the pea cloth whatsoever. And so it needed a new name. I love the name Pika. I thought, well, I could spell it with a Y. That'll make it cute. And so Pika gear kind of covers the apparel section of what we're doing. And then Kula Cloth is the overall brand, but also describes the name of a very, very specific product itself.
Wow. I love it. I love it so much. I love to hear the background. That's one thing I can forget to ask people. And I always want to know the significance of the name and where it came from, because sometimes it has just a really cool story and you learn things that you just didn't know before, like the origin of the word or the mountain. And lastly, I just want to mention too, because I know that this is a big part of you, but as I said, I knew of your brand and whatnot, but it was really recently at a friend's wedding up in Washington where I was catching up with another friend, and she was like, oh my God, you know who you should have on your podcast is Anastasia Allison. She created Kula Cloth, but I came across her while like being on a beach, and she was playing music, and she just goes out and plays music with like another person, a friend of hers, and they just like, they don't tell anyone, they just kind of go for hikes and play this music. And she was like, it was just so beautiful. It was the most like beautiful, surprising thing that I came upon of just hearing this music on the beach. And so I just wanted, and what is the name? Musical Mountaineers?
It's the Musical Mountaineers. Okay. Yeah. So that's myself and my friend Rose Freeman, who is a pianist. And Rose and I, you know, the Musical Mountaineers was also born during the same time frame after my sort of near-death incident, and I started trying to change my life. I am a lifelong violinist. I started playing violin when I was 4 years old. Again, always had so many limiting beliefs about what I could do in music because I was never, quote unquote, good enough to, you know, play on stage at Carnegie Hall, or so I thought. And when I decided to start changing my life, I had this kind of flash of inspiration that I wanted to play my violin on the summit of a mountain. And I won't get into the long details of how it all unfolded, but needless to say, Rose and I were brought together through a series of serendipitous events, and we began carrying a keyboard and my violin into the backcountry, putting on gowns and holding wilderness concerts for nobody. And we started that with absolutely no expectation whatsoever that it would, you know, become anything. We just wanted to do it, to see what it felt like to bring our music to the places that we love so much. And now this past year, we just performed at Benaroya Hall in downtown Seattle for the third time, raising money for the Washington Trails Association. We're going to be doing it next year. We've done benefits for the Washington's National Park Fund. We have done benefit concerts raising money for the Northwest Stream Center in Mill Creek, Washington. And so the fact that our music is giving back to the wild spaces that we love so much is really, really special and meaningful. And it's really important part of what I still do. Like the musical Mountaineers was what I was doing paralleling the development of Kula Cloth. And so in all of the moments where I doubted myself, I would go back out into the mountains, play violin, and I would kind of remember, hey, it's a big world out here. You're going to do fine, Anastasia.
Oh, I love that so much. It sounds like so full circle, except from all these limiting beliefs from the park ranger to the music and getting to this place later in life that you have found a way to connect all of these things and step out of those limiting beliefs and, full circle has no ending. So you're just going to keep going. These things that you're creating, like I said, that are all interconnected and bringing people, like making things more accessible for people. Really, there's some other products on your website. I definitely everyone go check out Kula Cloth for sure. I think that having this conversation was an amazing way to show people you don't have to be just a minimalist, outdoor, backcountry backpacker to have a Kula Cloth. You can take it out on an everyday hike if you're going out just for the day or whatnot, because you just don't like to drip dry. Now you're holding it or something, you don't have to. This is an amazing piece of gear. The shorts, the Rapunzel gator, like I said, I already have 10 uses for it in my brain. That is definitely going to be added to my cart right now. The collabs with brands, nonprofits, artists, I love it. I don't know, I'm sure you talk to many women's brands out there, but I an ambassador for Dovetail and a sales rep, and I know they have a drop C overall that I'm like, a Dovetail Kula collab could be an amazing
that would be
thing.
So fun. Yeah. I'm a huge Dovetail fan too.
I love it. Before we get out of here today, though, I want to thank you first off so much for sharing all of these parts of your story and for actually taking the step, making these things and creating this product that was something we didn't know we needed, right? And I think that's a huge step. A lot of these things come about that. It's like something you didn't know you needed, and it makes so much sense once you think about it a little bit more, see it. So will you just let people know the best way to find you, find your products, and how they can follow along on all your endeavors?
Yeah, so our website is just Kula Cloth, KulaCloth.com. Our Instagram handle is the exact same at Kula Cloth. My personal Instagram, where I post weird random stuff, is at anastasia.allison. And my personal email is just anastasia@kulacloth.com. We're a really small team, and anybody is welcome to reach out at any time, even if it's just to say hello.
I love it. Awesome. All that will be in the show notes, guys. For sure, check out Kula Cloth. Follow along Anastasia. If you're in Washington, keep an eye out on your hikes for the musical Mountaineers. I hope to run into you guys on a summit someday. And I thank my friend Whitney so much for kind of reinvigorating this, your name in my mind to get you out here and talk about all these things. And I'm sure, and I sure hope anyways, that we'll talk again. So thank you so much, Anastasia. Everyone out there, check the show notes, follow along, and thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode and would do us a huge favor, since we don't have any sponsors or anything like that, and would rate and review us on whatever platform it is you use, Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, whatever it is. And if you're listening and downloading just through the website, tearingituppodcast.com, leave comments. We'll definitely engage back with you. And on social media right now, we're just on Instagram. Tearing It Up Podcast is the handle. Like the post, share the post, comment on the post, whatever it is you got. Show us your love so we just stay relevant and show up in the rankings at all. So again, rate and review, please. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.